The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, aka ISIS,
Areas where ISIS rules. ISIS.
which was active in the Middle East and especially Iraq and Syria, was considered a hybrid of several ideologies. However, ideology was a point of contention within ISIS, as they would sometimes work against their own teachings of Islam. ISIS was established in 1999 under the influence of al-Qaeda, but they strayed toward other ideologies more in line with their greedy political desires, which often clashed with Islamic teachings. So al-Qaeda publicly expelled them from their radical group. But by that time, al-Qaeda was relatively weak, and ISIS had reached a point where they didn't need their support. Compared to the other jihadist group, the most special thing that we observed was the use of modern technology at the optimum level for spreading their ideologies. It's well known that many Islamic people living in Western countries migrated to Syria and Iraq during the peak period of the ISIS conflicts to support their military campaign as soldiers. This was the result of the brainwashing campaign that they carried out through social media, mostly targeting young Sunni Islamic followers. The radical group also used social media effectively for their fundraising. ISIS became very famous in 2014 after announcing the formation of their own caliphate stretching from Aleppo in Syria to Diyala in Iraq. Then they carried out a massive military campaign against the government forces as well as opposition terrorist groups in those regions, spreading the territories of their caliphate. Western nations identified this as a huge threat to world peace and announced their support for the mission against ISIS. The US-led coalition launched airstrikes against ISIS in the same year to control the rapid rise of this jihadist extremist group.
States will do with our friends and allies to degrade and ultimately destroy the terrorist group known as ISIL.
The peak level of the war lasted for more than 5 years. Abu Bakr was born on July 28, 1971, in Samarra, Iraq. He was a graduate of Islamic theology and completed several degrees related to the subject at a young age. Then he joined Salafi jihadi groups in Iraq following the US invasion in 2003. He was arrested with a group of al-Qaeda leaders at the American Camp Bakr in 2004 on charges of extremism. At that point, he turned to al-Qaeda, and his dedication to the group helped him to rise through the ranks. In 2010, ISIS went through a restructuring process, cutting ties with al-Qaeda. Their separation from al-Qaeda became official in 2014. On the one hand, this had a negative impact as they lost the support of the biggest terrorist group in the region with many international connections. However, it was not a big issue for them as they had sufficient firepower and manpower to establish their dream caliphate. The Shura Council, composed of top-ranked leaders of the Islamic State, decided to appoint Abu Bakr as the first caliph of their newly declared caliphate. However, his appointment was rejected by most of the Muslim community in the Middle East as their ideologies and efforts directly opposed the pure teachings of Islam. They were declared to be an extremist organization, and no international acceptance was given to their caliphate by the international community. The absence of direct international support was the biggest issue for their dream caliphate. In the past, US or Russian-backed Western camps supported most of the terrorist groups who fought to win something from the existing government. But ISIS did not stand for anything like that. Their mandate was to spread their Islamic ideologies. That's why they failed in getting the support of the international community for their mission. Even though they had no support from the international community, they were able to spread their ideology to 8 more countries. Its branches, supporters, and affiliates started fighting over the border. So neighboring nations identified ISIS as a virus that could easily spread into their nations as well. So they took immediate action to suppress the power of ISIS by supporting the other rebel groups who were fighting against this caliphate claiming to be an Islamic state. That became a key reason for their failure. All these things demonstrate the lack of proper international policy within this structure called the caliphate. Under normal conditions, if a terrorist group were fighting against a US-backed government, then Russia would support them and vice versa. But ISIS fighters were attacking both Americans and Russians. From the start, they were naturally opposed to the Americans, and they coordinated several international-level attacks on the US and other Western nations supporting the US. In return, the Western camp gifted more than 8,000 airstrikes to ISIS fighters. ISIS's Egypt affiliation blasted a Russian passenger plane through a blast attack, killing around 224 people. This made Russians very angry, and their president Vladimir Putin gave his full military support directly and indirectly to Bashar al-Assad's Syrian government to attack these violent barbarians. At the same time, Bashar al-Assad's administration in Syria was very important for the Russians, as it was the only Middle East country permitted to maintain a Russian naval base in the Black Sea. So Russians didn't want to see the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's administration in Syria. They initially carried out airstrikes from the Khmeimim base, targeting the ISIS militants as well as opposition to the Syrian government in the northwestern region of Syria. But with the rapid rise of the Islamic State, especially after the attack on the Russian passenger plane, the Russian government decided to involve itself in ground operations as well. Russian Special Operational Forces, military advisors, as well as private military contractors like the Wagner Group were sent to Syria to support in the battles against the Caliphate. Abu Bakr was just someone who learned about Islamic theologies throughout his lifetime and had a narrow view of things happening in the wider world. If ISIS had maintained a good relationship with either the Americans or Russians, it may have been successful or existed longer than it did. Abu Bakr saw them only as Christians or Catholics, and he dismissed them as enemies. That was Abu Bakr's biggest mistake. Even though Abu Bakr was the leader of the Islamic State, they had no clear control over the things that happened in the name of the Islamic State. Put simply, they had no proper coordination between the fighting units. Fighters from different countries joined the Islamic State. They had no idea what was going on and were just following orders coming from anywhere. Some fights were not only to spread their ideologies, but for private gain as well. At the peak of the IS Caliphate, Abu Bakr controlled more than 40% of Iraq and 2/3 of Syria, making it a true caliphate. However, their short-sighted policies led to their own collapse. Even after capturing such a large area, Abu Bakr lost 95% of that total land area within the next 2 years, as his defense was not properly planned. The whole world stood against them, including even the Sunni Muslim nations. No one wanted to be a part of a caliphate controlled by a group of extremists with barbarian policies. By December 2017, Abu Bakr lost control of the Iraqi city of Mosul and the Syrian city of Raqqa, which had been the main administrative centers of their caliphate since its establishment. Iraqi President Haider al-Abadi announced victory over the IS Caliphate in 2017. Then they formed into smaller groups carrying out attacks on a small scale. However, they shifted their administrative bases towards eastern Syria, and they were also severely attacked by the US-backed Kurdi forces and Syrian Democratic Forces, pushing them towards a few villages along the Euphrates River. On December 19, 2018, US President Donald Trump announced the official victory over the Islamic State.
Says it has started withdrawing US forces from Syria. The White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders has said in a statement that the troops are returning home as the country transitions to the next phase of its campaign.
Then he withdrew 2,000 US troops from the Syrian territories that were carrying out missions in support of the Syrian Democratic Forces. The final attack on the IS fighters was carried out in February 2019 by the Syrian Democratic Forces.
It continues to lose ground in Syria, but it's putting up a brutal fight.
Their final fortress at Baghouz fell on March 23, 2019. ISIS fighters and their families surrendered on a massive scale after formally ending the caliphate. However, Abu Bakr was hiding in northern Syria even after the failure of their caliphate. In order to capture Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the 75th Ranger Regiment and 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment of the U.S. Army carried out a raid through airspace controlled by Russia and Turkey into the rebel-held Idlib province of Syria. Even though the raid was successful, U.S. forces were not able to capture the IS leader as he self-detonated a suicide vest.